Thank you, Irina. Thank you, dear friends, dear colleagues, Mariana, Volodymyr. It is a pleasure for me to be here tonight in the City Hall. There are three things I would like to mention before I start. I'm going to speak in Ukrainian. It is quite difficult for me. It is the first time for me to do this in Ukrainian. I have never done this before. I usually come to Ukraine and I am saying to my colleagues, I have a standard response, the introduction. I'm here only for 3 days. I have just come here. Maybe in a week or so I will start speaking Ukrainian. I'm not fluent in Ukrainian. I don't quite remember the language because I have no one to talk to in the US, but I'm here for 3 weeks already, and there are people who have seen me 3 weeks ago here, and they will say, or they will rather think that he's saying nonsense, because we know he's been here for 3 weeks already. So this is a secret. I have never done this before. I have never done this in Ukrainian before. So I'm sorry for some of the possible mistakes or some Russian or English words, but I'm sure you're going to understand everything I'm saying. So we are about to start. It's high time. As you can see, the topic is for the missing page in the museums, the history of Jewish communities as part of the multi-ethnic heritage of Ukraine. So I decided to have this illustration, because you cannot do without illustrations these days. And I'm sure you recognized this image. Citizens of Lviv know that this is mezuzah that used to be there, but it's not available anymore. It's missing, and I think it is a very good metaphor for my story tonight. So this page is missing because the history of Jews who used to live in the area of the present-day Ukraine, and everything which is missing in the historical museums and historical studies and films and school textbooks. In other cases, in popular culture in particular, it is quite present. In fact, it is not missing. It borders with different stereotypes and cliches. We all know all of these examples, and this is something I'm going to present to you tonight. So let us consider and find out the reasons why the true history is actually missing, and how we could solve this problem with the help of the museum space in the broadest sense, and also how we could use other educational tools at our disposal. The loss of this history and the fact that it is missing does not imply we are not able to detect it, that it is hidden somewhere, that it has disappeared. It is not so, because the remains of this culture and these stories are all around. They are here. They could be found in many towns, cities, shtetls where Jews used to live. There are Jewish buildings, synagogues, cemeteries. They are in films, in photos, in archive documents. All of this could be identified, assumed, and detected, as long as there is the interest from the people, the society, the legislative and financial approach of the state or philanthropists. It could look like a very simple process, like you find and you show, but somehow it is much more difficult and complicated, because the problem is aggravated by some of the bureaucratic issues and the lack of the generous philanthropists, and also some of the problematic aspects of Ukrainian Jewish relations. It might sound as a complication of this topic, but I believe, well, actually, why are we talking about this today? It is obvious that in order to provoke some interest to somebody else's life and to the historical and cultural heritage, we need to know who these people were, how they used to live and what they did, and why they are no longer here, why they are missing in the village or a town they used to live for many centuries. As to some of the problematic aspects of the relations, the problem is even more aggravated and deep. maybe we might think if we fail to settle this for so many years, how could we settle this now in some 40 minutes? And also, how is it related to museums in general? So the first thing, what do we know about each other, Ukrainians and Jews, and where we could find this information? One of the answers and places where you could find this information could be the historical museums, either the permanent or temporary museum exhibitions. But before we start talking about the museums and how they represent this topic, or rather not represent the Jewish history in Ukraine, we must focus on the history of Ukrainian Jewish relations in the 20th century and also in the 16th, 17th, 19th centuries. Why do we need to make this journey or tour back to this history? Because without the understanding of this history, we will not be able to design any historical exhibition that would meet the requirements of the present days and enjoy the consensus not only among the historians but among the general Ukrainian public. It might sound utopian, I know, but museums and interesting historical exhibitions keep being designed and presented, and Ukrainian should not be an exception. In order to understand this history, we will need to consider the examples of some peaceful coexistence of the two nations and also touch upon some of the complicated and contested and disputable issues of our common and shared history. The history of Ukrainian Jewish relations, well, actually I split my presentation, my lecture, into three parts. The first part will touch upon the history of Ukrainian Jewish relations through the prism of a dialogue of intellectual elite, the historians and public figures. And then we shall talk about the painful, some of the sore and the disputable aspects of Ukrainian Jewish relations, such as what doesn't allow us to watch into one another's eyes, and also I will talk about some examples of political and economic cooperation between Jews and Ukrainians, and then I will also present some suggestions as to the integration of Jewish history into the existing museum space of Ukrainian museums. So let us talk about the history of this Ukrainian Jewish dialogue. What have we achieved and what still needs to be done? Where should we be going? The good news is that this dialogue has resumed already some 50 years ago and it is ongoing, which means that we are going in the right direction. But the bad news about this is that this dialogue has not really progressed a lot and it has low capacity to go beyond the intellectual declarations and the good intentions of the national intellectual elite and some of the economic and political circles of the society. To start with, we need to say that this dialogue is much older than the independence of Ukraine or the establishment of the State of Israel. The roots could be traced back to the second half of the 19th century, to the times of the so-called national activization, when the Ukrainian and Jewish national movements have been born, like Zionism and nationalism. This was the time when Ukrainian Jews could not be possible. There were Russian Jews who used to be citizens of the Russian Empire, and the Austrian Jews, the citizens of the Austro-Hungary. Jews, the same as Ukrainians, were divided with the state borders, but united by the language, their belief, and we might say the culture. But this is another story. In addition to Yiddish, the Jews also used to speak Russian, German, Polish, and some other cases, in some exceptional cases, the Ukrainian language. These were the Jews who opted for this anti-imperial approach and attitude. So actually most of the Ukrainian, or the Jews who used to live on the territory of the present-day Ukraine could not be called Ukrainian Jews, but we all understand who we mean by this. What was great during this period of national innocence is that the Ukrainians and the Jews did not only recognize each other's existence beyond the market, but also try to find some mutual grounds and forms of political dialogue. They tried to consolidate their political forces for the sake of their both nations within the two autocratic empires that divided Ukrainian lands. The most active and the most effective part of this dialogue was taking place in a more liberal political environment of Galicia, under the rule of the tolerant Habsburgs. Maybe in the central Ukraine and eastern Ukraine, there were fewer achievements because there were autocratic rules of the Russian Empire. As we all know, the result of this cooperation here in Galicia was the representative deputies of Ukrainian deputies in the Austrian parliament, because there was the election in 1907 to the Austrian State Council. Actually, in the urban constituencies, Ukrainians voted for the Zionist deputies, and in rural areas, the Jews were voting for Ukrainians. And due to this political understanding and mutual understanding, the Jews actually had two deputies in the parliament in Vienna who were the first deputies. This discussion that was initiated in the end of the 19th century and then lasted until the start of the First World War, and then culminated in 1917 during the Russian Revolution and the establishment of the national states and the debris of the former empires. And it was for the first time in the relations of Ukrainian-Jewish relations that this dialogue actually went on to the new unprecedented level of cooperation. When the new democratic multinational states were established, the Jewish communities and other ethnic communities like Polish and Russian could actually be acknowledged and recognized as religious minorities. I mean, the Jews could enjoy this privilege in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but it was for the first time that they could be considered equal among equal. And the Jews could receive their cultural and personal independence, develop their own religious, political, and educational institutions and establishments. It was quite a decisive turn of events that actually turned into the practical field. Unfortunately for both nations, for Ukrainians and for Jews, this state-building project, some sort of experiment in a way, failed to be implemented. Ukraine went ahead of its times, and the tragic fiasco of this political experiment actually laid the foundation for more of the division between Ukrainians and Jews. I mean, the civil war and the bloody pogroms. In the opinion of many researchers, they were actually preceded the Holocaust. All of these tragic events left aside the Ukrainian Jewish political cooperation and relations at this nation-building state as failing. Both nations accused each other in betraying one another, and we could realize this only several years ago. From the Jewish point of view, the Ukrainian Revolution flooded in the blood of Jewish pogroms. Moreover, beyond the area of Ukraine, the Ukrainians were taken, and Jews were taken as Ukrainian phobia supporters, and Ukrainians were taken as the agents of Russification and the allies of Bolsheviks and members of the so-called Jewish communist bloc. In Galicia in particular, it's Steicher, the Polish-German agreement by Reich in war 1725, but the last nail into the coffin of this partnership was the murder, assassination of Simon Petlura in 1926 and actually in 1927 there was no sentence for the assassinator, so there were no attempts to resume this dialogue in the 1930s, and we might have examples of what I mean. These are the famine, the Stalin repression in the Soviet Ukraine, the world financial crisis, recession, and the severe, tough competition between Ukrainians and Jews in these lands, radicalization of Ukrainian nationalism. All of these events actually reverberated in Ukrainian Jewish relations during the war, but in 1939, with the start of the Second World War, it all changed from bad to even worse. I probably understand what I mean. These are the tragic events during the Holocaust in 1944 through 1945 1941 to 1944, and actually the dialogue that used to be there in the 1920s, as a result, came to an end, to an utter end, and it seemed there were no chances to resume it in the future. And the reason for this categorical disruption of relations are well understood. This is the Holocaust, the collaboration of Ukrainians with the Germans, the Ukrainian radicalism. Many Jews actually had an impression that Ukrainians were the worst. And you could hear this everywhere. And this statement was widely used by many Jews who survived the Holocaust in the territory of Ukraine, who actually faced Ukrainians as the members of the German battalions, but also the Jews who survived the concentration camps, who faced Ukrainians who used to be the guards in Majdanek, in Auschwitz, and also some of the death camps in Belzec and others. Also, there was no practical basis for this dialogue because Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and the Jews who remained and stayed in the Soviet state were Soviet citizens, part of the multi-ethnic state, which was only on the paper because according to the constitution everyone was equal on the one hand. But on the other hand, in 1948, the Jews who left Europe could finally restore their own state of Israel, and the intentions of this new state was generally to collect all of the Jewish diaspora in one national house, to build a new, very strong nation, free from all of these sins of diaspora, such as archaic things as national equality, national autonomy. The notion of cultural or national autonomy was already the relic of the past. Who would need this autonomy if you have your own state? At least it was this way in Israel. But in the Soviet Union, even if Ukrainians and Jews wanted to resume this dialogue, they obviously were not able to openly speak about this in the Soviet Ukraine. There was the only place where this dialogue was possible in the Soviet Union. These were the camps, the Gulag camps, where Ukrainian and Jewish political prisoners, the dissidents, the Ukrainian nationalists and Jewish Zionists, and human rights advocates found themselves in the 1960s, 1970s. Paradoxical enough, but in the Gulag camps they could openly speak about this. It was there when the Jews and Ukrainians shared the same physical space, the barracks, and they could not ignore each other. Both Jewish and Ukrainian nationalists soon realized that despite all of the crucial differences, they actually shared something. This was the urge for freedom. Later we can find out that all of these discussions and personal contacts laid the foundation of a new dialogue, but it was already in the independent Ukraine. At the same time, this resumption of the dialogue between Ukrainians and Jews started in the USA and Canada in the diaspora. But as I have already mentioned, there were only two places in this world in the times of the Soviet Union to speak about this openly. It was the Gulag camps and the diaspora. In the diaspora, in the USA and in Canada, Ukrainian Jewish intellectuals realized that this dialogue was really badly needed and important, and it was one of the main reasons to resume this dialogue somewhere in the mid-1960s or in the late 1960s. Am I too fast in Ukrainian? In the 1970s and in the 1980s, there were several meetings of Jewish, American and Canadian scholars. I mean, they were not all Jews in terms of living in the Israel, and Ukrainians did not live in Ukraine at that time. They used to live in the USA and in Canada, and these meetings actually were taking place in Canada and in Israel, and they were very important and instrumental in the development of this dialogue. But there might be a question, how come that this dialogue is related to the development of Ukrainian historical museums, but For the most part, it was the dialogue between the historians, political scientists, public figures, journalists, not the physicists, engineers, or others. Therefore, the subjects of these meetings and conferences was the history, the ancient history and the modern history. Both sides, Jews and Ukrainians, were trying to figure out and to study the relevant historical narratives, not only to find the mutual controversies, but they were trying to find the so-called usable past. When I'm talking about the usable past or the usable history, I mean the careful study of where we used to be, who we are, where we are now, where we could be heading, what we could expect to do. All of this is very good, the same as 50 years ago, historians and public intellectuals keep meeting together and discussing these topics, but all of these discussions and contemplations, the same as before, do not go beyond the narrow academic circles and milieus, and they are not transferred to the national scale, unlike the dialects that we have in Poland, and they are starting in Lithuania and other former USSR states. As I have mentioned before, we still are lacking some good books, textbooks, films, but I believe there is a huge interest to the history and to the past, because you are here and I can see different people here of different age, and I believe historians and museum experts should take use of this opportunity, and I think this will help us get from the dialogue between historians to the dialogue within the museum space. Where and how are we learning about our history? These are the books and the films, and also historical museums. Museums and the school textbooks do present and interpret history and shape the understanding and attitude to the historical events. These are two important components of our world. It doesn't imply there are no other aspects, but these are very important. What could the visitors be able to see or not able to see in the Museum of History or historical exhibition will actually shape their understanding and awareness of this history. It's all very simple and clear. Usually people go to museums to find for information and knowledge, and actually it largely depends on the museum curators who are designing the exhibition of what the visitors are going to borrow. They are interpreting the historical knowledge for the broad audiences. Museums usually are suffering from the current ideology, the ruling ideology. If it's totalitarian, then there are no exceptions, only the clearly preset line and the approved interpretation of history. But if it's a democratic state, actually it looks like it seems everything which is not forbidden by the law is allowed. It's all very clear, but in practical terms it's much more complicated. The state museums are called the state museums because they are budget-funded institutions funded by the state. They can only afford some free thinking and speak against the state who are funding them. I don't think so. And I will give you some examples of some exhibitions that you must have heard about that could be the exceptions. I mean, the National Space and Aviation Museum in Washington that displayed the plane that dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and there was this tragic history of this terrible crime. Another example could be the exhibition about the Wehrmacht crime in the National Museum of History in Berlin. We could also speak about the exhibitions in the museum I work in, the Holocaust Museum in Washington. There is part of the exhibition on the politics of the so-called closed doors about the refugees and the migrants who were trying to flee Europe and to head for the USA. And the American administration rejected this idea to bomb the railway track leading to Auschwitz, or these incinerators or gas chambers in this death camp. So these exhibitions are an important event in the cultural life. They are most interesting and they evoke a lot of interest among the public. The level of free thinking is proportionate, in our opinion, to the level of democracy and development of civil society in these countries. So what is the present-day modern museum space in Ukraine, and how is Jewish history represented within this space? While preparing this lecture, I looked through several websites and I found a dozen of Jewish museums in Ukraine. Maybe this is wrong, and I will be happy if I'm wrong, and if you can clarify that there are many more of them. The largest of them is the Museum of the Memory of Jewish People and the Holocaust in Ukraine. It's in Dnipro. And some of more moderate and modest museums, it doesn't mean they are worse, they are just smaller in scale and in size. I mean the Jewish museums in Odessa, Чернівці, Kharkiv, Kryvyi Rih, Khmelnytskyi, Kherson and Lviv. This is not a unique phenomenon any longer. Even though all of these museums are private and are funded either by Jewish community or by individual benefactors. In addition to the permanent exhibitions available in the Jewish museums, we know that there have been several interesting temporary exhibitions about the history and culture of Jews in the state museums of Ukraine, such as in Kyiv and Lviv in the first place. There are 3 exhibitions running these days in Lviv. And all of this testifies to the large progress and great achievements. Some 25 years ago, Ukraine had no Jewish museum or Jewish exhibition at all. 25 years ago, it would have been very difficult to imagine me telling you about this in the city hall in Lviv. But we cannot claim nothing is happening, and contemporary Ukrainian citizens know nothing about the Jews. The magazines, the newspaper articles are telling a lot about this. So this topic is not new, and those who are interested in the topic are able to locate the necessary information. Talking about all of these great achievements, I might repeat them again. We all also know that usually this knowledge is quite archaic and fragmentary in nature, but the most important thing that they are beyond the general context of Ukrainian history and the culture and history of Ukraine. Why is Jewish history not available? Why is it missing in the regional and national historical museums? How could we bring them back there, and in which form? And why is this information missing? Let's try to figure out why it is missing. I think the main reason is that there is a lack of knowledge and understanding of Jewish history among the non-Jews. But actually, the Jews are not the great experts in Ukrainian history. Both nations have some vague and distorted understanding about certain historical stages of their shared history and religion, traditions, etc. And there is a lot of maneuvering and falsification about this. So we could call this by the term ethnocentrism. All of this is very difficult to overcome and integrate into the historical or museum space because it doesn't fit into the well-established canons of the Ukrainian history or the Jewish history, especially when we deal with some of the most controversial and painful episodes of our history. Shortly about what I mean. Usually historians mention 5 events in the Ukrainian Jewish history that are most problematic. I'm sure that you all know about these stories, but I will list them. This is Vadim Altskan uprising in the 17th century, the Haidamaki uprising in the 18th century, many pogroms, a number of pogroms that started in the 19th century. I'm not talking about Vadim Altskan and Haidamaki because that's a different story. And then until the Civil War, and the most horrible thing is the Holocaust. Are these 5? Yes, 7, I rather think. How do we, Ukrainians and Jews want to treat these events? I mean, us as Jews and Ukrainians, as two nations. Do we see these events differently? If yes, then why? I have already mentioned that all of this is aggravated by the Jewish-Ukrainian relations. These relations are aggravated and complicated, but despite them, when we try to explain what happened and why this happened, what are the consequences of these tragic events, we fail to understand our common history and have the objective and comprehensive museum display and exhibition. Let's go back to the roots of these problems and take a brief look on the Jewish and Ukrainian historiography. How does Jewish historiography take the Ukrainian history and vice versa? Talking about the historical lens of the present-day Ukraine, in the traditional Jewish text, you can find a list of pogroms and the vows during many Cossack uprising, national liberating wars and revolutions, the Nazi occupation and the Holocaust. This is the culmination, the climax of this bloody history and the end to end. This is a political history, the background of historical events. The social history, actually, if we imply the history before the 1917, before the revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Jews had lived in their own world with their own religion and customs and traditions, which actually separates them fully from the rest of the population. They only meet them in the market or sometimes at school. Other nations, not only Ukrainians but also the Poles, are just random characters in this history. They're not there. The post-1917 history is a little different because there were migrations, nationalizations, assimilation, and therefore it's very different. So this is a very general perception of Jewish history, of Ukrainian history by Jewish historiographers. Then the vision of the Ukrainian historiography of post-Soviet historiography. Of course, this is the national liberating fight against the occupiers, the tragedy of the famine, and also the self-sacrifice for the sake of the independence of Ukraine, Soviet repressions, and the culmination, the climax of this story is the proclamation of the independent Ukraine in 1991. Over the last 25 years, there have been very many, maybe not very many, but many interesting research works on Jewish history, but mostly they have this post-Soviet approach of linear history without the true deep analysis. Jews are basically missing in the Ukrainian historiography, and the history actually looks into itself, and Ukrainians and Jews live in two parallel worlds, in two solitudes, and this is the first problem. I could term it as mutual lack or missing page. And also another page, another phase of this historiography is the mutual presence. And we could talk about such uprisings as Honta, Zalizniak, where post-Soviet historiography introduces new characters, Stepan Bandera, Shukhevich, Stitsko, almost all of those who were fighting against the occupation regimes. And here we can see another grave problem. All of these characters of the recent Ukrainian history that are programmed as national heroes in the present-day Ukrainian historiography and Ukraine in general, they are not always the heroes for Jews in other ethnic minorities such as Russians or Polish communities. And why is it important for this discussion? I believe the problem is not about being in favor or not in favor to these heroes or characters. The problem is that they are presented as unanimous heroes. But I think the problem is not about these heroes, these characters, but about the historians and journalists who actually assign a lot of heroic features to them, sometimes even non-human, but they actually were human beings with all of the errors of a human being. All of this is aggravated by the fact that these heroic narratives present Jews and other ethnic minorities of Ukraine as negative characters, if they are present at all. In the best cases, at most, they are the collaborators of the occupational regime, that the Ukrainian heroes are leading the holy war against, or just the outsiders, the visitors who are not interested in the affairs of the country they live in. In the worst cases, they are those that this national liberation war of the Ukrainian people is targeted at. And if you take a look at this Ukrainian history in such a approach, in such an attitude which takes only one side of the question, then we can see that the discussions of these liberation fights would always have the stories of murders, assassinations of the Jewish collaborators. But could these national heroes be the heroes for the descendants of the religious and ethnic minorities who are the present-day citizens of Ukraine? Of course not. These ethnic minorities are not able or are not willing to share this history with the ethnic majority of the country. As a result, they are found beyond history, or maybe only as the above-mentioned enemies or collaborators. Some Ukrainian historians are presenting the history of Ukraine as the history where they are usually the victims of other nations, exploiters. And so the violence against the Jews and the Poles is the eternal boomerang of the mutual hatred and revenge. They are the enemies. They used to kill us. They used to torture us. We are now taking revenge and doing the same. And I think we could actually put a full stop on that point and maybe leave this history for some better future times, because Ukraine now faces some more important problems. But I think it is important now. It is high time we find this important. We cannot actually postpone it to some other times, because it is connected to with the future of Ukraine and the generation of citizens of Ukraine who have been born in the independent Ukraine. And I believe this is going to be some of the fundamental, instrumental things to determine their world outlook, who shape them as a nation, and this part of people who used to help develop their nation back in their times. And unlike all of the previous centuries, and it is a very important point, Jews and Ukrainians now have their own independent states, and therefore this dialogue could become possible on a new level, on a higher level, where Jews and Ukrainians could interact as equals, and none of the third party could interfere with this dialogue. Our children and grandchildren are learning some history now and are going to learn some history in the future, and what kind of history they're learning about largely depends on us. Is this going to be a black and white history, or the multidimensional history with many tints and colors? We are learning history not only of the mere interest, but because we are trying to locate and find ourselves in this history, trying to find the answers we are concerned about today. I'm not going to quote some important quotations, but they are very important. One of them belongs to a Lviv ethnographer, Mr. Dashkevich, a historian. He used to write many years ago, in the present-day historiography of East European Jewry, there are many topics related to the persecution and extermination of Jews. There are many black and bloody pages, but there are also many pages that are written in neutral and bright colors. Otherwise, we would not be able to explain the fact that some 25% of all of the Jews in the world in the early 20th century were focused and concentrated in Ukraine. And then Dashkevich says the next thing. This one-sided approach to history actually aggravates this animosity in the attitudes, and the period of persecution is considered to be almost a natural state, end of quote. And then Dashkevich finishes his article and mentions something I have already mentioned. There is this third party that used to interfere this dialogue between Ukrainians and Jews, because this third party never wanted this dialogue to be consolidated. Another quote. This is the quote from Miroslav Marinovich. I'm sure you know who he is. So here what he says. The history of Ukrainian-Jewish relations is the book of mutual misunderstandings and spontaneous emotions. The main factor is that Ukrainians and Jews have different models for survival. Ukrainians survive with one strategy and Jews are using a different strategy. And there is a misunderstanding on the verge of these differences. Ukrainians survive in their own historical homeland, and this is the territory that could be provoked and perpetrated by the occupiers and foreign forces, so they have to respond to the external threat. On the other hand, the Jews have lived for 2,000 years in the modern terms among other nations. The Jews that do not have their own land, in most cases, they are taking the strong conflicting part, because if they take the weak party, that would imply loss and liquidation. Since Ukrainians have very often and for the most part been the weak party, then the attitude of the Jews seems to be anti-Ukrainian all the time, and this is the basis of the problem. Miroslav Marinovich not only states the problem, but he suggests a very practical, good practical solution to it. So here what he says: Ukrainian nation should not be accusing the Jews in the lack of loyalty or accuse them in creating alliances with their perpetrators. Ukrainians must become a strong nation, but not in the old ways with weapons and state violence, but they should be the fair masters of their own land. And in other terms, they should have a successful Ukrainian state project, and then Ukrainians will join, the same as it happens in other countries, and this way they will become the loyal part of the Ukrainian civil society. Getting back to these two long quotes by Dashkevich and by Marinovich, let us try to see what is positive and general in our history and culture, and how this could be used in the museum space in the general sense. Some examples. There could be one example, such as you can be telling about the role of Jews in the development of Ukrainian industry and economy. Of course, Ukraine did not exist as a country, as a nation, as a state, but there was the Ukrainian land. So this is just a general approach that could be used by some of the exhibitions covering some development of industry and economy and touching upon the developments of modern Ukraine. Since we are in Lviv, let's talk about some Lviv-based entrepreneurs. Maybe in the near future, one of the Lviv historical museums is going to have this kind of exhibition. They will be able to tell not only about Jews, but also about the activities of Polish, Ukrainian, Jewish entrepreneurs and financiers who used to build and develop great things. I used to take a walk around the city center in Lviv, and I could see some memorial plates with the names of the people who funded the construction of this or that building. But who these people were, where did they live, what did they do, how did they look, nobody is writing about this. And I hope that Lviv citizens know about these people. I will be happy to know that they are aware and they are familiar with this, but I haven't seen this. Of course, we could say that it's about capitalism, exploitation. The Jews were exploiting the others, they investing the money to earn more money. Well, this is the second nature of capitalism. This is not truly so, because in addition to all, the Jews and other minorities, ethnic minorities also were engaged in a lot of charity projects. They used to live in Ukrainian cities in Kyiv, Poltava, not only in Lviv, and if they intended to live there, they invested into the improvement of the urban infrastructure. And another small illustration, you might know the name of Yakov Arenstein from Kolomyia city. I believe his name should be known to most people in Ukraine, because this person and his publishing house in Kolomyia contributed a lot to the development of Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian intelligentsia. He published 320 volumes of translations of classic European culture, philosophy, and the other is Ukrainian language in particular. And the entire generation of Ukrainian intelligentsia grew on the basis of these books. They had a chance to know about the European classics because these books were published in the publishing house of this person. It is a very important topic also, talking about the Jews and the revolution of 1917 here in Galicia. It would be very relevant to talk about this in Galicia in particular, that Jews were present in the Galician army, and there was this Jewish military detachment, and Solomon Lamberg headed them. And it was part of this army, and they were active fighters and soldiers in the battles in 1918 and 1919. And actually in Ukrainian Galician army there were also very many Jewish doctors. And there is a question that Lviv museums, well, Ukrainian museums in general, but they are telling about this history, hardly anything. So these were some of the simple issues, and now we still have several minutes left. Let's briefly talk about the complicated issues. I will only give you one example about the Cossack Wars of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. How do we present this history in the school textbooks and in the museums? This could be presented as the war, the armed fight of Ukrainian peasants and Cossacks against their perpetrators. This is how it is presented in most Ukrainian museums and textbooks, and I hope it is in the textbooks this way. But for the Jews and also for Poles, for Greek Catholics, Ukrainians, this period of the Bogdan Khmelnytsky uprising and the events of 1648, these are the events described by renowned historian Hanover. This is the Void of Despair, the title of the book, and he records the social, economic and political background of the Ukrainian movement against the Poles, and also he gives a very detailed description of the terrible pogroms in the context of this movement. Therefore, the Jewish historical testimonies claim that Bogdan Khmelnytsky liberation fight actually entailed a lot of violence against the Jews. The main issue and the main question is, was this violence actually justified? Could this be justified, these deeds could be justified without the murders of women, children and old age people? But this is the question that should be addressed to the modern Ukrainian citizens on the basis of the modern values. So talking about this uprising of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, we should be mentioning not only the fight for national liberation, but also we should be mentioning the fate of Poles, Jews and Ukrainians, because it was this triangle of the conflict. So if you are trying to describe this period in books and in museums, we will have to attend a number of issues that are not quite present, not only for Ukrainians in terms of Ukrainian-Jewish relations, but also in Ukrainian-Polish relations. We will need to explain why the Jews were coming to Ukraine. Were they the soulless colonizers of Ukrainians? Were their presence only negative, or did they contribute to the economic development of these areas? We should also be mentioning that attitude of the Jews. According to Shimon Dubno, a Jewish historian, the Jews actually found themselves between the two cruel forces. Maybe they were not only the suffering part, but also the hammering on them. What has been happening in this period in Ukraine? Have they paid attention to who was using the peasant labor and in which way, and what was their role in this process? Would it be right to say that the Jews actually created this system? No, it's not this way, but they were an integral part of this inhuman system of exploitation and humiliation. We know the Poles were remote and distant, but the Jews were close. That's why they were targeted in the first place. Could Jews be able to explain this situation to their Ukrainian neighbors now in the 21st century? Could Ukrainians be able to understand these circumstances, not in the 17th century, but now in the 21st century? It needs to be done because this triangular conflict model will be replicated by different actors, including Russians and Germans, etc. If we fail to understand what happened in the 17th century, we would fail to understand what was happening in the 20th century. See how many questions I raised, and I believe this history could be very complicated and contested and controversial. So it would include not only Ukrainian, but also Polish and Jewish history. There is a choice either to answer these questions or maybe to present everything as a linear exhibition and story and narration. Obviously, I'm more interested in the first option, a larger scale option where each ethnic community will have their voices. But it's not about my personal interests, but about what is the right approach and attitude to history. It is only when we have the answers and solutions to all of these problems we would be able to talk about the all-comprehensive approach to the history and presentation of this history in Ukraine. Are we able to give the clear-cut answer or the assessment of these events? Of course not. And why we should be doing this now? This is the history that still is under research and under study. I can see I'm pressed for time, and since I promised I will tell you something that can be done about the museums. We will have a movie, we will have a film, obviously. So, the same as Boris tells, I should show something. This is actually mentioned what Ukrainians did and Ukrainian Polish entrepreneurs did. I mean, Lviv citizens can recognize what that was. This is the building of the Jewish hospital built in the early 20th century. It is now functioning as a hospital. But who allocated the funds for this hospital? This person. A few people actually know his name, and even fewer people know how he looked like. So maybe in this hospital, as I told to the students, we could have a small exhibition telling of who this person was, what he did. And I know that the Lviv National Picture Gallery has two portraits. You could have a copy. It's not important to have an original portrait, actually. So it says it's a Jewish hospital, of course, but all we know is when it was built. So this is the illustration. When we talk about the Ukrainian People's Republic, it is important to know that there were not only pogroms, but also the cooperation. There was the Ministry for Jewish Affairs. This is a separate issue for discussion, but maybe you ask questions about that. This is what I actually meant, something I wanted to mention very quickly. In Ukraine, there are several, 3 or 4, I used to think there were 2, but they told me there are more great museums that are the museums of folk architecture and crafts. One of them is in Lviv, in Kyiv, and in Uzhhorod, and somewhere else. As far as I understand, people who are looking at this photo might claim that Jews didn't use in villages, they lived in shtetls, in towns, but I think if this is the folk culture or architecture, this is how it is. It doesn't look like a building from Lviv, from a big city. It looks like a house from a shtetl, from a little town. These houses are still there, but you can see their dilapidated condition, and I think maybe it is a crazy suggestion, but these buildings, if they could be saved and transferred to the museums of the kind, maybe in Kyiv, because this is from Vinnytsia region, I think these buildings are still preserved in Galicia. So this is how they look. I also wanted to mention something about the synagogues. This is the synagogue we saw last Saturday in the city of Drohobych. Do you see the condition? And this photo actually illustrates it very well. Can you read this great banner? This is Bogdan Khmelnytsky claiming we shouldn't be speaking, we should be acting. I think this motto is a very good illustration to call for the reconstruction of this synagogue. At least this is the impression I got. Maybe there was a different intention. So this is how the synagogue in Sharhorod looks like. As far as synagogues are concerned, they cannot be transferred to museums, but they could be restored. And should be saying some words about this. So what do we do about these synagogues? They could not be used as synagogues because there is no, and there will never be a new Jewish community any longer, unfortunately. But what are they doing in other countries? In Romania, in Serbia, in Lithuania, they are restoring the synagogues and actually using them as museum spaces and concert halls, exhibition areas. And I hope the Jewish community of Ukraine would not oppose this use of the synagogues, because this is the alternative to their destruction. And there is some successful stories and examples from other countries like Romania, Lithuania. This is Zhovkva. This is how it looks now. This is how it used to look in the times when it served as a synagogue. This is the synagogue in Satanov. This is some of the rare examples. This is how it used to look like, and this is how it looks now after the reconstruction. It doesn't imply that all of this is going to serve as an exhibition hall or as a museum. I think it would be right if there will be some small exhibitions in these sites informing the people visiting about where they are, that it used to be a synagogue, and there should be a list of people who donated to the construction and reconstruction of the synagogue, maybe some brief history of the Jewish community. This is important because I believe this represents the link of the epochs that should be resumed and developed and enhanced. And I can see I am pressed for time, and I will briefly show some more suggestions about the regional and local history museums. What could they be able to do? They already exist, and they could tell to the local residents the history not only of Ukrainians but also of the other neighbors who used to live next door to them. And there are thousands of historical documents that the researchers have not touched upon. And this is not the story of Ukraine. In addition to the images and the text documents, there are thousands of hours of interviews of the so-called oral history of the Jews who were born at the territory of the modern Ukraine, who used to live here before the war, who survived the Holocaust, and who used to live here after the war even. All of them have a lot of stories about living together with the Poles and Ukrainians as their neighbors. They mention a lot of details, and there is a rich collection of historical films filmed by American Jews from Argentina as well, who used to come to Ukraine in the 1920s, 1930s to visit their relatives. They were filming the so-called home videos and family videos. Many of them have been digitized and are available in archives and could be used in the historical museums, even in the school museums. And this will help to build the bridges and to raise more interest in the history, to establish personal contacts with the present-day residents of the cities and the descendants of those who used to live there or who was born there. When this is happening, both parties are able to establish this dialogue and to find this dialogue very useful and interesting. And this will help overcome the manipulations and confrontations and establish a better dialogue. This is a gradual process, and I can understand it will not happen overnight, but we should start this process someday. The sooner the better. What could Ukraine get from it? The Ukrainians could be more pragmatic about it. I mean, this is about tourism, and Ukraine can benefit from that. People are coming here because their roots are here, because their grandparents still live here. I can hear very many stories about these heritage trips. Many people go to Paris, but fewer people go to Stray or Bucic. This is a very interesting thing for this heritage tourism. There are some people who are developing the routes, they are preparing to these trips, but what they see there, they fail to find any traces of this civilization, any traces of life that their grandparents told them about, or something they read about in the books. So usually there are cemeteries grown in weeds, if it is still there, the ruins of the synagogue, some Jewish schools, and actually the lack of awareness among the local residents. Usually their meeting with their homeland stops there. They are hardly possible to come back or maybe bring their children and grandchildren. I think it would be better to have it differently. And now I am about to finish, and I would like to reiterate that our Jewish-Ukrainian history is contested. It is complicated, but there are no simple histories, so we have to face it. I don't think that in complicated times the history should be romantic and heroic and inspiring the spirit, the national approach. That is why, since we know very well who is to blame, let's talk about what should we do. I do not have any ready recipes, but obviously there are certain problems that our generation of historians shall settle. So Ukrainian historians should take aside from these heroic cliches, because this heroism is not a scholarly definition. This is, in my opinion, an emotional feeling. What Jewish historians could do, they might and they should reject this outdated Ukrainian phobia approach, claiming that Ukrainians were the worst. But can you tell me who was the best in these times? We need to study the history, and we need to do this in a fair and honest way, not avoiding these contested pages. Ukrainians and Jews should remember that the representatives of both nations and the acts of the historical figures are never the general manifestation and or denominator of the entire nation. And I should quote the famous quote by Moscow Rebbe. Trotsky actually does the revolution, and Bronstein would have to pay for that. So it's about Leo Trotsky and Lev Bronstein. The entire nation cannot be responsible for the acts of one person or the group of people. The same as patriotism is not the feature of one nation. This is usually the ethnic majority. Ethnic minorities are also entitled for that. Most of the Jews who live beyond the Ukraine, they actually supported all of the 3 Ukrainian revolutions, and this way they confirmed their support of the independence Ukraine urges, and it makes us closer. It brings our countries closer, our interests and our history closer than ever before. And the most important thing is that this conversation should go beyond the conferences and roundtables and transform into the general Ukrainian scale discussion in the museums, in the cinemas, and in the public space of Ukraine. And museum experts, historians, journalists, Jewish Ukrainian intelligence should be doing this with the support of Ukrainian public and non-public institutions. That is why I'm really grateful for the Center for Urban History to have this discussion here in the center of Lviv, in the building of the Historical City Hall. Thank you for this. Vadim Altskan, the first time in the Ukrainian language, the first night. And now we can see some hands raised.
I have several comments to make about this. I'll try to make them brief. In everything that you said, I think one of the prerequisites of having, I won't say dialogue, but conversation between Jews and, if you want to say, Ukrainians, is that you need a Ukrainian dialogue, Ukrainian relations, particularly given the shifting borders of this part of the world, the shifting populations, like in this very city. The population in this city right now is not the population that it was before World War II. Many people here have no contact with the city and its history. They don't have roots here. The shifting power structure, who was ruling what, and all of that. Where we are now is not Ukraine, it was Poland. It was Poland, Lithuanian Commonwealth, whatever you want to say. But you have to have a Ukrainian dialogue or conversation about Ukrainian history, what it means to be Ukrainian, what Ukraine means. I don't like the way you sort of put Jews as one monolithic group. If you say Jewish historians, maybe, I listen to the translations, so you say Jewish historians have a way of looking at things, as if historians who are Jews are driven by emotion and ideology and not by scholarship. A scholar, whether he or she is Jewish or Ukrainian, whatever, should be driven by scholarship and research, not by ideology and emotion. So I don't know what you're talking about like that. Also, if you're talking about a Ukrainian-Israeli dialogue, a state-to-state conversation, relations between Ukraine and Israel, that is not a dialogue with the Jewish world. That's a dialogue between the state of Ukraine and the state of Israel. The state of Israel does not represent Jews around the world. They don't. They may say that they do, but it's a state now, and they've been demonstrating it. Most Jews in the United States are not Orthodox, they can't get married in Israel. So Israel is its own state, and a dialogue or conversation or diplomatic relations between Ukraine and Israel is not a conversation or dialogue with the Jewish world. There are a lot of things. Also, in my field, you talk about what should be done with these buildings all over the place, which exist not just in Ukraine, but in all over Europe, frankly. Should, and they, and what should be done takes money. And the money is not there. In Zhovkiv, there have been plans for 20 years at least to restore that synagogue. Where's the money? If the money was allocated, where's the corruption that dissipated it? I remember speaking with people, 8 years ago or so, about the exact plans they had to restore that synagogue. It hasn't happened. Meanwhile, the synagogue in Putyaki was a museum, but the museum moved out. The synagogue is abandoned and derelict now. So, and also there were plans for a long time to make all of Shargorod a sort of shtetl museum. But it takes funding and it takes money. And there are so many places. So to develop funding sources, and many of the funding sources that for a long time were funding this type of work have dried up. So it's easy to say should, and they. But who are the they? It's we. We, or someone with money. Shargorod was one man, one rich man is the one who did that.
Can I start answering because there's
so
many questions.
Fine.
I'm afraid I'm losing.
Я все-таки вас переб'ю. Дорогі друзі, хто не
I will
розуміє.
interfere. Those who don't understand English, we still have a lot of headsets over there. You can use them.
Англійською мовою вам відповім. I will answer in English. This will be much easier, I think, for you to understand what I'm trying to say and what exactly I had in mind when I said they, who should. Number one, Ukrainian dialogue. I don't think it should be, just one dialogue. It could be many dialogues. I'm not saying that it should be Ukrainian Jewish or Ukrainian Russian or Ukrainian Polish. It could be many dialogues. All dialogues are very useful. And as many as dialogues you have, I think it's useful thing to resolve any issues, to have a dialogue. So Ukrainian-Ukrainian or Ukrainian-Polish dialogue doesn't preclude Ukrainian-Jewish dialogue. I hope you agree with this. When it comes to Jewish scholars, what I meant, they're definitely not necessarily Jewish, and I said this, but they're not Jewish. You know, some of them are Ukrainian, some of them are Dutch, Polish, you name it. They live in Israel, they live in the United States, they live in Europe. And if you look at many books, and I have no time to mention good new publications, I can name you, books by Henry Abramson, Prayer for the Government, Yohanan Petrovsky-Stern book, Shaul Stamfer. There are many, many scholars who are doing wonderful work. But the majority of works published until recently, you can say until Ukraine became independent or until Ukrainian archives became open, more or less have the same story. It's about pogroms, it's about horrible life, it's about persecution, it's about difficult life of average Jewish community or average Jew in the territory which is now Ukraine. I'm not saying that it's exactly the same picture, things develop. We have now, I mentioned only 3 historians, I can mention more. But predominantly, in what I call classic Jewish historiography, this is the depiction of what happened. This is why Dashkevich, I think, it's a long citation, I gave only one part, but he counted, if we add all this horrible time in the history of the relationship between Jews and Ukrainians, we're talking about maybe 60, 70 years total. This is not a kind of scholarly approach, but just to give you a sense. But Jews lived in Ukraine for 600 years, so why we only concentrate on...
What do you mean by Ukraine? That's what I'm saying.
Well, it's a very, very difficult question, which many scholars now are trying to answer. Of course, I mentioned in the very beginning, Ukraine didn't exist. Ukrainian Jews didn't exist. I said this in the very beginning. There were Russian Jews because they were residents, citizens of Russian Empire. There were Austrian Jews who were citizens of Austro-Hungarian Empire. So we're talking about Ukrainian Jews. They appeared, a couple of years ago. You can say, technically from the moment when Ukraine became independent. Most of them don't speak Ukrainian. They speak Russian. But they live on the land what is now contemporary Ukraine. So I think it's pretty legitimate. It would be pretty legitimate to consider them Ukrainian Jews. Okay, I did a few more questions you have. So of course Israel doesn't represent all Jews. It doesn't represent me. I don't live in Israel. But what I was trying to say is that this dialogue can be done at a completely different level. Before establishment of Israel and before Ukraine became an independent country, we were talking about diaspora, we were talking about countries which are part of other countries. Now it's a completely different case. One country which doesn't represent all Jews, I agree with you, as an independent country, can talk to another independent country called Ukraine. And I don't see any contradiction with what I just said. What should be done? I don't know. If Ukrainian government thinks that this is a responsibility of only Jews to restore all these buildings, to restore all these shtetlas, to restore all this synagogue, I don't think it's the right approach. Of course, those who are interested, and we have several examples, only in Ukraine, who are in Drohobych, I showed you one synagogue, I didn't show you another one. It's done, it's under restoration, and it's financed by one person. So, can we multiply this? Can we clone this person and have more projects like this? This would be wonderful, but again, it's all done on individual basis. But in places like Lithuania, which you know very well, I can show you, you will recognize. This is Zamosh, I'm sorry. This is how synagogue, so-called Y synagogue, looked in Yanishkis before restoration. This is how it looks like now. Yes. So I think Ukrainian government can apply for the same funding. Well, maybe in the future. I'm not saying that it all will happen after I finish my presentation, or tomorrow, or even after tomorrow. It will take time. But people have to be informed, and this is the main point why we're doing what we're doing. I think I answered most of your questions, but we can talk about this later.
Ellen Ruth Gruber ставила своє перше запитання.
Ellen Ruth Gruber was asking her first question, and we will be able to listen to her lecture the day after tomorrow on Thursday. Vasil Rosevich, you're welcome to continue. Thank you, and thank you to Ms. Gruber, because she actually made me think about other questions that I initially had. So, what I would like to say, so when we are talking about the dialogue between the states or between the nations, it is the instrumentalization and overgeneralization. But unfortunately, we live in a post-Soviet space, and the post-Soviet space implies the mandatory, almost mandatory understanding that there should be some general approach of the state on the history. There should be some approved canon or something. And when the two states meet and start their conversation, then we have this impression that each state presents their concept and approach, and they agree and arrange among themselves what they should add or maybe take away, and they are trying to reach the compromise. Of course, there is a little of academic research and academic and scholarly approaches, and there is a lot of politics in there. Since the historical policy and historical politics is politics in the first place, and we have the Institute of National Memory in our state, this is the institute that is in charge of developing this policy and imposes a lot of different stereotypes, and they're claiming to approve this concept that they made up of this national liberation fight. Then we might have a question that when a state sort of approves this concept and takes it as its own, then the state is responsible for all of those that the state appointed as heroes in the past. So if President Yushchenko appointed Shukhevych and Bandera as national heroes, then the Ukrainian state is in charge and is responsible and liable and accountable for all of the activities of Shukhevych and Bandera throughout all of their lives, not only in the specific periods. If the national state introduces the commemoration policy and naming the streets and the avenues with the names of these historical characters, this is the historical position of the state, and the state is accountable for that. So, and this is actually something that makes me think that it's not that the Ukrainian origin historian or Jewish origin historian or Polish origin historian is saying this. So if they are using their ethnic roots, this is actually the subjective approach. This is not a scholar, obviously. But we even have the special commissions of historians who are close to the public authorities who are presenting this concept. They are actually sort of fighting at a war. There is the commission of Ukrainian historians against the commission of the Polish historians who are fighting over the Volhynian massacre, etc. They're claiming this, these are claiming those, etc. What I mean, and well, thank you for the lecture, and my question to Vadim is, do you think that maybe if we don't change the concept of Ukrainian history from the class fight, because it's still the class fight between the classes, because Bogdan Khmelnytsky and Haidamaki period, they were largely presented in the Soviet history textbooks, but it was presented as the fight of social classes with some aspects of the national hints. Later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it has become the element, this fight of classes has become the element of the so-called national liberation fight. So if we don't take away from our textbooks and from this national canon of the state, if we don't take away this concept of the national liberation struggle, do you think that in our museums, who are going to use the ready product, something the academic historians are going to prepare for them, the museum experts will not develop their own concept of history? So if this fight of classes, the national liberations fight, is going to be there still, are we able to get to the point someday to show something we mean now to the normal people? No, of course, we shall not get to that point. I do support your opinion. If it is not going to be possible because this is not history. This is, well, the history of the fight of classes. The history is something broader. It includes not only the political fight or class fight, but also social history and many other things that should be included both into the textbooks and into the museums. If Ukrainian history only has the fight of classes, then there is no history. There is only the chronology of the struggle for liberation, of the, whatever they are called, national liberation fight. We're not going to proceed with this further. Well, that's clear, that's obvious. As far as the Institute of National, Memory is concerned, we have talked a lot about that, and I think that this institution, I'm not sure, well, it is also available in other countries, in Poland, in Czech Republic, but I think this institution is some sort of a Soviet relic, post-Soviet idea, the idea that you can actually impose or maybe put on the patriotism. This is not done this way. We know how this could be brought up. This is a long, thorough work. You cannot just put a branch on a tree and you have the fruit overnight. This is a very long process. A person cannot wake up in the morning and feel a patriot of his land. I have several suggestions how this could be done, and I think that this should be done on the grassroots levels, on the lowest levels possible, when some school pupil could be interested in the history of his village, of his town, through Jewish history, for example, to see and understand that there is something in his village or in his town that doesn't fit the Ukrainian canon. Maybe the Jewish cemetery with these headstones, with the confusing characters. If this small person, a schoolboy, gets interested in this, this is going to be a bridge to another culture. And if this bridge is built, this young person then so this will be very important for this young person to expand his horizons this way. He or she will be able to get to know a different culture and a different history. And this is how the interest would emerge about the place he was born at. I'm sorry, my Ukrainian is exhausted. I will have to switch to Russian or to English because it's very difficult for me to answer the questions in Ukrainian. I feel it's very difficult for me anyway. So I will switch into Russian, if you don't mind. We have used English, let's now use some Russian. Katerina Tumanova, the Vizbruch correspondent. I have one question about the practical suggestion. How do journalists write about historical personalities not to present them as heroic, romantic characters taking out from the pedestal, to present them as living beings? How do we draw these historical parallels so that people would read it in the media? Well, it's a very difficult question. How do we do this? I think, we shall shift into Russian. I think that heroes are important, but average people are even more important, because not everyone can be associated with a hero. Of course, there is a warfare in Ukraine. It's all clear that these are obvious things why we would have heroes popping up. But the war will be over someday, because everything comes to an end someday. And if this history only has the heroes in it, which is the legacy of the Soviet and post-Soviet historiography, this will be a very sad picture. This is something that Vasil meant, he left, unfortunately. We need a true, real-life history, the history of average people, like all of us. Not everyone will be able to be a hero. Maybe I was too fast and I was too long. But the heroes presented in the Ukrainian historiography, and Ukraine, unlike the neighbors in the West, like Poland or Czech Republic, is still a multinational state. There are also many Jews living here, 100,000, 300,000. There are also Polish communities, Crimean Tatars, and others. This is a multi-ethnic state. And I think it is very important for Ukraine as a multinational state to find the heroes who would be consolidating, not disjuncting. Try to find the heroes like this, and you could be writing about them. For me, these could be the people who were building your city, the industrial people, the financial entrepreneurs, who would be the heroes. Of course, they are not that perfect like the knights, noble knights, etc. They were the capitalists, they were the businessmen, they were trying to earn money, but try to write about them. You have these memorial plates claiming he constructed this building, but nobody knows who he was, how he lived. Maybe there are some families still living here. You should be talking about people who are less controversial. Don't try to opt for heroes that are disjuncting and dividing the society, but try to focus on the heroes who are consolidating the country and uniting the country. I think Ukraine needs this badly these days. Ukrainian needs friends, specific states and specific people who will be able to help Ukraine. It is very difficult to explain to Jews who live in New York or in Jerusalem why the street has the name of this or that person, who are perceived by Jews historically as differently, actually. They are associated with non-heroic deeds. Do we need this? Are these people heroes at all? And this is the second question. And also for Ukrainians, you should not be talking about the present-day heroes or recent heroes. What about Bogdan Khmelnytsky? It's not all obvious. It's not all that obvious. There are several streets, there are several monuments, but what are his relations to this city? He used to study here, we know this, yes. But what happened next? So I would not even try to or focus on the present-day heroes, contemporary heroes. You could go back into the ages of history and could see many controversies there as well. Thank you for your story. It's the third time I'm listening to you, and it's the first time in Ukrainian. I was listening to your story at Radio Skovoroda, and also I was listening to the public lecture by the Center for Urban History. My question is about ethics, trauma, and museum space. It's about the painful, horrific topics that we are not always able to perceive this experience. And then we will have a quote, the quote of resentment, irritation. They called from bank to me and informed that I would have to go to a different part of the city urgently to the only open bank division and pay another installment for the loan, because before the war I bought a refrigerator. This is the irritated quote from a teacher from a land that we call the ATO area today. Do you think that the museum space should try to help manage this experience? Should it be healing or helping these people, these kind of people? Because we do have relatively many of them. As far, if I understood your question properly, how could museums help in healing the traumas, the historical trauma, right? It depends on the museums, of course. If you imply, do you imply historical museums or picture galleries, or? I implied the museums that are trying to talk about catastrophes and the experience like this. I'm trying to find some good examples. I'm not sure how the Holocaust Museum in Washington or Yad Vashem in Israel are helping the people who survived the Holocaust to cope with this trauma. I think, yes, they are helping to many people. I know many Holocaust survivors that I used to meet in person while working there for many years. Of course, there used to be many more of them several years ago. They found it very important to know that this museum does exist. The place that they know they could come to, maybe there is some photograph or some artifact related to the place where they come from. We have this glass wall with the locations of the vanished Jewish communities. Not all of them are there, but there is this small town of Kozienice in Poland that he saw. So he used to say that my city is not there. It was a huge trauma for him, but it was very important for them anyway, that their history and their story, their trauma, their tragedy actually found their place in the museum. This is the place where they could bring their children and grandchildren and show the illustrations to their family stories and to their experiences. And this is the example to answer a question. Well, obviously, yes, they could be healing the traumas, but it's not universal for museums. There are people who would never step into these museums because they believe the museums are not reflecting all of the history of their personal tragedy, that all of this is just the theatrical presentation, the exhibition, the performance, that it would not be possible to tell about the true tragedy with the help of objects, exhibits, and the good narrative museum. And a very important museum, the 9/11 Museum in New York, that was opened several years ago for the families who lost their family members. This is the place where they come to commemorate them because they do not have the grave of their kins. They do not have the remains. So this is the sacred place that they keep coming to, like to the cemetery. But it's even more to that because it's New York and it's we're very tolerant and cautious designing this museum. So this is the brief, my long answer to your brief question. Thank you for the interesting lecture, Vadim. It was truly interesting. While listening to all of this debate and to your lecture, I keep hearing about this national policy and national liberation struggle, the fight of classes. Maybe we should start from the social life in this issue, and maybe we will be able to find many more positive shared features of the coexistence of these two ethnicities, of Ukrainians and Jews. And Jakob Ornstein from Colombia, that hardly anyone knows about. There is the period of the Western Ukrainian People's Republic. There are regular announcements of posters, and they always were published at least in 3 languages: Ukrainian, Polish, and Jewish, sometimes German. These are the positive examples, aren't they? Actually, in the villages, Jews also used to live in villages, not in every village, just few families, of course, but they were there, and they used to coexist together. They used to live next door to Ukrainians, and they had the good neighborhood relations, usually good relations. Lviv citizens might remember that several years ago we had a great book by Alexander Granov published, Here Comes the Man. So these are the memories, reminiscences of a Jewish person who was born in a little village in Snyatin region, and how their family with many children used to live next door to Ukrainian community. So when we start creating these museums with these small but very positive stories, then eventually they will shape the national policy. I think so. At least this is going to be an impetus, because everything that is imposed from above usually is destroyed. Well, I wish. Well, thank you. I'm very happy to see you, by the way. We have many years of work together. I do agree with you, and something that Vasil mentioned before, I maybe was very fast. Maybe if we had 2 more hours, do we have? No? I'm not sure what the people think about this. I had illustrations and examples of what we could start with, but I had to fit in the timeline. But the most important thing you mentioned, and I truly support this, social history, social class history, this is the relic of the past. Nobody needs this any longer. I attended several exhibitions. Even the people working in the museum don't find them interesting. Well, I'm not sure who were those who designed the exhibitions. You haven't been at the previous workshops here, but it was mentioned several times that it needs to be changed because it doesn't meet the needs of the present day. This is the outdated problem. People want to know how their predecessors used to live, what consolidated them, not what divided them, because people want to live together, whether they want it or not. They have to live together. All of this folklore, Yiddish, Ukrainian, food, many other things. How to include and fit all of this into the exhibition and translate into the museum language. This is another problem, a much more complicated problem than the discussion. We are all aware of this fact. But all I wanted to say, actually, could be summarized into sentences. I wanted to say that we do need this kind of dialogue, and it shall be there, but not during the lectures, the roundtables by historians, ethnographers, other scholars, you name it. This shall be the dialogue that should go beyond this milieu and this environment. We should have public exhibitions about that. We should have films and books about that. Then this is going to be part of your everyday life if you're interested in that. And of course, no pressure from above should be there. You are right to say that everything that is imposed from above will dissolve very soon. We will all be able to see this. So the main task is to transfer this dialogue of elites into the general national discussion, to transfer it on a national scale. And we have examples to that. This is not only about Ukraine. This situation actually happened in Poland. You know this book by Jan Gross, The Neighbors. This is now happening in Lithuania, even though facing many barriers. I'm not trying to think of other countries, but I'm sure this is not a unique case about Ukraine. And Ukraine has many examples to borrow. Thank you to Vadim for the lecture. This is the first lecture, I think, that makes people reflect on their own attitudes rather than asking questions. To me, as a co-organizer of this event, I find it very rewarding to have people reflecting on their attitudes. Thank you for bringing the topic of museums to a different level we have not had before in our lectures and discussions. We consider these museums as some sort of scapegoats, especially in Ukraine. Everything is wrong with its history, with its past. We're showing it and displaying it in a different ways. We have the museums as the scapegoats that are doing things wrong. Thank you for actually showing this chain and talking about this area beyond the museums, about something that shapes our attitude to the past. It starts from the family, and then the children go to school, and when they get to the exhibition, that deviates from the dominating pro-Ukrainian narrative, and they see that before the war, for example, Ukrainians used to be the third community, not the first community. So the first question they might have would be, how come this is not possible? And then these children with the Ukrainian-centric narrative would proceed to the university, to the historical faculty, and actually they are teaching not the history of Ukraine, but the history of Ukrainians. And then they go to work at the museums. Or maybe if they don't work at the museums, they keep visiting the museums. So we can see this closed link and chain. And we can see museums reflecting the society. And I would like to ask everyone start thinking about this from this point of view. And we should start talking about the responsibility of museums, responsibility of those who are writing the texts and placing the objects right here. But the situation that Ukraine finds itself in these days, I would like to be talking about the courage of the museums to voice the unpleasant history. Because in this situation, you need to be bold enough, because you get the visitor with a Ukrainian-centric, heroistic narrative, and they want to see this in the museums. That is why the next generation of museum workers in Ukraine, I hope, will be the courageous, bold people who would be willing to tell the story differently, and it will be less pleasant. And also, I would like to comment your story. If we are not going to talk about these very complicated, contested, and bloody and unpleasant aspects of the Ukrainian-Jewish relations, then we will have no chance as an open, democratic nation for the future. We could be telling how great it was, but why did we have the pogrom in Lviv in 1941 if all of this was so great before that? And I think the objective and the task of historians and museum workers is to show this multi-layered and multifaceted situation. And we should not be afraid of that. And we should not be afraid of the knowledge, because the knowledge consolidates us and enhances us. And thank you for including this museum. So far, this is the vicious circle, the catch-22. But if we start talking about this, if we start thinking about that, we have a chance to break this vicious circle. Well, I'm stopping now. I will just commenting on what Irina said. I obviously do agree with you. So I didn't imply when I meant we should be talking about social history that we should be talking only about the beautiful Ukrainian songs with the motifs of Jewish tunes, etc. Of course, all of this would be also interesting, but it doesn't imply that we will be omitting the topics that I mentioned, some of the painful moments of history that I mentioned. Then, yes, of course, we badly need this, and this manifests the readiness of the citizens of this country to boldly look into the eyes of what actually happened. I have had the experience previously here that I'm trying to accuse the Ukrainian nation, the 17th century Cossacks. Actually, this is not about them. This is about us. We cannot reconcile the Ukrainian insurgent army veterans and the Red Army veterans. They were fighting each other, they were shooting at each other, and they will never be able to understand each other. But it's about the generation of young people. They do not have this burden all over them, on their shoulders, ideological, historical burden, whatever. They are free people. They do not have these attachments to the people who used to the thing that used to chain their parents and grandparents. These are free people, and I can see them. I have been coming here for many years, and I know the people who are the same age as Ukrainian independence. These are utterly different people. The students I'm working with today, this is a very different group of people. I know their parents, I know their grandparents, and I can see the difference. So, the hope, it doesn't imply we don't need you any longer, we only need young people. We need everyone, but we should be relying on them, because they are free thinkers, they are free people who have never experienced slavery. So if we empower them to design these museums, to design these exhibitions, and to write these books, I think they will manage. But it is important for them not to have any barriers in their way from the state, from some institutions, etc. I know that the authorities are not willing to help, but I would like to wish them that they just don't interfere. All of these permits, the stamps, etc. But we have what we have. That's why I'm trying to address the young people. They should be the link relating our generations, our cultures, and our traditions. Thank you. Thank you for your lecture and for your ideas, and thank you for getting down from the level of the state functioning of history, all of these state programs and discussions within the narrow academic circle, and started talking about the everyday functioning of the history and the role of history in the non-expert environments. Some of the situations and cases you have in the family, in the school, well, you maybe forgot your school years, but you do have the legacy of their concepts in your heads, and the museums also should play a role in bringing up intellectuals, and they will actually have an impact on that. So my question will be about this core aspect of your lecture, about the dialogue, about the spaces, the platforms for this dialogue, taking into account all of the complicated situation in Ukraine when we have the state-funded museums, that we have very few free media that will be able to launch this discussion, that wouldn't transform into the conflicts of bots on the internet. But we should also talk about the resources, because when people get into this dialogue, each of them has their own burden and baggage, using the categories they are accustomed to, like the class fight, whatever, and the liberation fight. Where should this dialogue be taking place, and how it should be taking place? How do we break this vicious circle that is actually focused only on itself? So that's it. That will be my question. Thank you. I wish I could know the answer. This is a huge question. I think this process has already started, and actually, usually you can see better from the outside, and people who live here, they are more pessimistic than me because they live here. I don't live here. I come here maybe once in a year or 2 times in a year, and there is certain progress in place. Maybe you are not able to notice it, but the things that are taking place in Lviv, and actually the fact that we are now here in this room, this is another stage of the progress. This is not a narrow circle of the university professors discussing something at the round table. These are just the people who came here because they find it interesting. Another example, there is the Great Class Fest taking place. I've seen the pictures, I haven't been there, but I could hear the comments. This is great. You could never imagine this some 25 years ago, even 15 years ago. Now in Lviv, 3 exhibitions on Jewish culture are running. Of course, you might argue about how they are done and why, etc. But these are the professional discussions, the expert discussions. But for average people who find it interesting, they can see enough materials to get interested. The summer school, organized by the Center for Urban History for 8 years already, always has a Jewish aspect to it. This could be, well, a crazy suggestion, a crazy idea, but can you imagine that Shevchenkivsky High Museum, in addition to all of these great Ukrainian huts, would get also a Jewish house, or the house from some German colony, or whatever, whoever used to live here, of different nations. It's not that they just put up the house and they claim that the Jews used to live in this house. But you could add other things. It could be music, some food, some craft samples, anything you can fantasize about this that could correlate with the historical truth, of course. You can present everything then. So whenever a person comes to this kind of museum, everything that we are able to see so far is just Verkhovina, Transcarpathia, Lemka region, etc. And here you are with another element of culture, which for an average Ukrainian boy or girl is something unknown, and this is the only place to see it. They will not be able to see this anywhere else, like in Strio, Sambir, or elsewhere, as this is not a quasi-culture like Disneyland. This is the true house, the actual house, with the actual furniture pieces. You are still able to find them with the interior restoration. There are great documents to show the interiors of Jewish houses. There are some results of the study tours by the Academy of Ukraine, by a group of St. Petersburg scholars. You have tons of materials, actually. And this is not an expensive or costly project, actually. You can restore this house and bring it here. This is not a multi-million project. If a specific, some individual philanthropist or maybe regional administration, I don't want to point fingers at anyone with his financial burdens, but if anyone is interested to do this, this might be very interesting. This is another example of what could be done. We could still talk long hours about this, and I will give you many more examples in the process. So that's why it's... Vadim, I would like to compliment you. I have also a small comment and a big question. Well, your Ukrainian language is almost perfect for me as an Aboriginal citizen. It's extremely rewarding because all of the population of Ukrainian or Polish or even Jewish population of Lviv is usually they have a lot of despise to the Ukrainian language. So whenever you address them in Ukrainian, they answer in the Russian language, and they keep looking at you at some kind of surf, something that started in 1918 and will never able to be stopped. And a comment. So the Jews in villages, I'm not sure about the wealthier regions like in the central Ukraine, but in the mountainous areas, for example, in the village of my mother, they used to have a lot of Jews, but there were few Poles because the village was cold, the land was not fertile. They were not interested, but they lived all together in the same conditions, quite poor, and that's it. That's the fact. I'm not a historian, but I'm trying to explain something and to clarify something for myself and to my tourists as well. These people, well, the Ukrainians who actually joined the police guards in the concentration camps, the Jews who later found themselves in the NKVD or the Red Terror. Sometimes you can see so many Jewish names there, and for an average reader or listener, a tourist, it sounds impressive and it might evoke a lot of negative emotions. So could we present this for the people in a way that on both sides there could be some beastly people who were not highly educated, but these were angry people with a lot of complexes to themselves and to the others. That's why they actually found themselves in this on these positions. So could we use this argument? Is it justified? I'm not sure about the correlation, but I think that the children of artists or businessmen could not be found in these positions. Even in the present-day society, we are sometimes angry at those who managed to be successful. We do have this. Maybe we could actually add this argument to some educational programs, etc. We can see historically how our hetmans used to build the churches and the monasteries, and they didn't quite take care of education. The same as the Polish authorities, who didn't really allow the rural population to education. And thank you for the compliment. 3 more weeks, and then I will be then. But I'm not going to stay here for 3 more weeks. But I will try to do my best. So, well, as far as your second question is concerned, the first question. Those who went to this police positions or NKVD, this is something I mentioned already. I think the worst thing about history is to generalize. we could actually call these people the crowd or the audience, but all of you are individuals who came here for their individual interests. Ukrainians, Russians, the Jews, if they are here, they are interested in this topic. This is not the audience, this is specific individual people. The same is about history. They joined the police for different reasons. I could give you a dozen reasons and you can give me another dozen of reasons. And the fact that they were bad people is not the only reason. Not because they wanted to be perpetrators. They had different reasons behind their decisions. Maybe they not always wanted to become policemen, but after that they actually were getting worse, not better. The same concerns NKVD. This is the typical question asked by many. How do you explain to, well, recently I've had this question. How do we explain that the Gestapo did not have the Jews, but the NKVD had the Jews? Well, actually, even me, I was taken aback. I hope you know the answer, but we don't have to explain. So I actually tried. There is the quote by a famous Moscow rabbi, Maza. The Jews came to him complaining they went to see Trotsky. This is a story. I'm not sure whether this is the record of his story, but it's a legend. So they went to see Trotsky because they asked him not to close down the synagogue because he was a Jew. And actually he responded that Trotsky will do the revolution and Bernstein will have to pay for that because this is the actual name of Trotsky. This is not the general situation about the nation or the Jewish community. These were just individual people. Of course, we could count how many Jews we had in 1921 and then in 1929. This is the horrible right, you know. But actually, why do we count? Why do we calculate at all? We could see that we maybe have more of Latvians, not Jews or Ukrainians in this or that specific areas. Does that imply they are better than the others? No, this is just statistics. That doesn't pertain to specific individual people. And we could be talking about this for a long time and maybe we would not be able to convince anyone. But I think it should go beyond any discussion in history because it's futile. It's just calculations. This is accounting and that's it. I mean, maybe some tools, maybe there are some tools. How do we bring this argument through to the governments and to the society so that it could be effective and heal all of these scars? Well, it depends on the government. I'm not sure how do we bring the message through to the Ukrainian government. I sometimes have to write letters to the highest level, like the embassy of the U.S. ambassador would actually deliver the letter, but we will never be able to get the answer. I'm not sure how it works in Ukraine, but I think the conversation about what the country can do could be secondary. In Ukraine, the same as any other normal civilized state, there should be civil society. It is not there because we don't want it. It's not that I'm saying this tonight and we have it in place tomorrow. This is the gradual, lengthy process. Let's take a look at what is going on in the Poland next to us. Sometimes it might seem it was getting worse, but we can see certain turns and changes taking place. So the only thing that could be instrumental in this process is the civil society. And an important role in educating and shaping the civil society belongs to museums, to textbooks, to TV programs, to newspapers and magazines, you name it. People would read it, you will see it, will take it and take this information in. It is very important to have a manifold approach to presenting this information, claiming that NKVD only had Jews, etc. It should be the well-weighed, truthful and bold history. And then the new generation, I'm actually largely relying on them, they will be able to perceive it. And for them, this history is going to be more understandable and clear, I think. Well, let us say thank you again. We had the world first night, Vadim Altskan in Ukrainian for the first time.